It was a busy evening at an upscale restaurant. The place was filled with laughter, soft music, and the clinking of glasses. Well-dressed customers sat at their tables, enjoying their expensive meals. The air smelled of freshly cooked steak and fine wine. Among them was a man who stood out. A wealthy businessman, in his late 40s, wearing a tailored suit and a flashy watch. He stepped inside with an air of confidence, scanning the room as if he owned the place. His shoes shone under the warm lighting and his cologne was overpowering. He smirked as he walked past the other diners, barely noticing the staff who greeted him. He didn't care about pleasantries. He wanted attention, and he expected to be treated like a king. A young waiter, probably in his early 20s, noticed him and straightened his uniform. He had been working long hours, barely making ends meet. His shoes were slightly worn, his sleeves rolled up from running around all day, but his posture remained respectful, and his face carried a polite smile. He walked up to the rich man's table, holding a notepad. "Good evening, sir. Welcome. Can I get you something to drink?" The businessman didn't bother looking at him. He pulled out his phone, checking messages. Then, with a bored voice, he finally spoke. "Just bring me your best wine. And be quick about it." The waiter nodded, keeping his composure. He turned to leave, but then the rich man called out again. "Oh, and make sure you don't mess up like the last guy. I don't have time for incompetence." The waiter clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He had seen people like this before. Tonight would be no different. The waiter hurried to the kitchen, his hands steady, but his mind restless. He had worked here for over a year, long enough to know how certain customers behaved. Some were kind, leaving generous tips. Others barely noticed him, treating him like part of the furniture. Then there were people like this rich man, loud, demanding, and full of arrogance. But he had no choice. He needed this job. At home, his mother was sick, and his younger sister was still in school. Their small apartment barely had enough space, but it was all they could afford. Every dollar he earned went toward food, rent, and medical bills. He worked double shifts whenever possible, sometimes skipping meals just to save money. Still, he never complained. He grabbed the bottle of the finest wine, carefully pouring it into a glass. The restaurant manager stood nearby, watching everything. He had warned the staff before, wealthy customers always come first. No mistakes, no excuses. The waiter understood that rule well. He had seen coworkers get fired over a single complaint. With a deep breath, he carried the wine back to the table. He placed the glass gently in front of the rich man. "Here you go, sir." The man barely glanced at it. He took a sip and smirked. "This is decent. I suppose even a place like this can get something right." The waiter ignored the comment, standing straight, ready to take his order. The rich man leaned back, scanning the menu. He ran a finger across the prices, but it was just for show. Money didn't matter to him. "Bring me your most expensive steak, medium rare, and don't take forever." The waiter wrote it down. "Right away, sir." As he turned to leave, he heard the rich man chuckle. "You know, I can tell you don't belong here." The waiter froze for a second, but didn't react. "People like you serve. People like me, we enjoy life." The words stung, but the waiter swallowed his pride. He had no time for arguments. Without another word, he walked back to the kitchen. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of silverware. The rich man, however, was louder than anyone else in the room. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone with one hand while tapping the table with the other. The waiter returned a few minutes later with a basket of warm bread. "Here's something to enjoy while your meal is being prepared, sir," the waiter said politely. The rich man barely looked up. He grabbed a piece, took a bite, then frowned. "This is dry," he muttered. "Do they not teach you anything here?" The waiter remained calm. "I can bring you another basket, sir." The rich man waved his hand dismissively. "Forget it. Just make sure my steak is perfect." He placed his phone down and stretched, making sure the expensive watch on his wrist caught the light. Then he glanced at the waiter and smirked. "You know, I remember when I was younger. I had nothing, but I worked hard, and now look at me." He gestured at himself. "Success, wealth, power, all because I made the right choices." The waiter nodded politely, but he didn't respond. He had heard speeches like this before, rich men who believed poverty was just a result of laziness. The rich man chuckled. But not everyone has what it takes, right? Before the waiter could leave, the man continued. You spend all day taking orders, running back and forth. For what? A few lousy dollars? He laughed. You probably think hard work will change your life. But let's be real, it won't. The waiter clenched his fist but quickly relaxed it. Getting angry wouldn't help, he just needed to get through the night. The rich man shook his head. Some people are just meant to serve. Satisfied with himself, he picked up his phone again, scrolling through stock prices and expensive vacations. The waiter turned away and walked back to the kitchen, his face emotionless. He had dealt with rude customers before. But something about this one felt different. Something told him tonight wouldn't end the way the rich man expected. The restaurant continued its smooth rhythm, chefs cooking, waiters moving, customers chatting. But at the rich man's table, something was about to change. The waiter returned, carefully placing the plate in front of him. A perfectly cooked, medium-rare steak sat on fine porcelain, the aroma rich and mouth-watering. Here's your meal, sir, the waiter said politely. The rich man picked up his fork and knife, cutting into the meat. He took a bite, chewing slowly, then suddenly he made a face. This is terrible. The waiter blinked, surprised. I'm sorry, sir, is there something wrong with it? The man pushed the plate away. It's dry, overcooked. Do you even know what medium rare means? Other customers glanced over, sensing the tension. The waiter remained calm. I can have the kitchen remake it, sir. The rich man scoffed. Oh, you'll have them remake it? Do you think I have all night? No wonder you're stuck waiting tables, no sense of quality. The waiter took a breath, keeping his posture straight. I apologize, sir. But the rich man wasn't finished. He lifted his wine glass and swirled it slowly. Then with a smirk he tipped it, letting the dark red liquid spill across the table, soaking the white tablecloth. Gasps filled the room. The rich man leaned back, pretending to inspect the mess. Oops, looks like someone forgot to clean this table properly. The waiter stepped forward to clean it, but the man raised a hand. No need, he said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. You've already proven you're useless. Silence. The humiliation was public, designed to make the waiter feel small. The restaurant manager rushed over, his face pale. He knew how important this wealthy customer was. I sincerely apologize, sir, the manager said. Then he turned to the waiter, his voice cold. Be more careful. We don't want problems. The waiter lowered his head slightly, taking the blame for something he didn't even do. The rich man laughed, shaking his head. Pathetic. But he had no idea that karma was already on its way. The rich man leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Humiliating people felt like a sport to him. He enjoyed the power, the attention. Other guests whispered, some shaking their heads. The waiter, however, remained calm. He cleaned the table in silence, his hands steady. Then, as if the night wasn't bad enough, the rich man picked up his steak again. He sliced another piece, chewed slowly, then suddenly stopped. His eyes widened, his hands went to his throat. Something was wrong. At first, people thought he was reacting dramatically, like before. But then his face turned red, his breathing became strained, he was choking. The rich man tried to speak, but only desperate gasps came out. His body stiffened, panic setting in. He gripped the table, knocking over his wine glass. Now everyone noticed. A woman at the next table covered her mouth. Oh my God, he can't breathe. The restaurant manager froze. Other customers looked around, expecting someone to act, but no one moved. The rich man clawed at his throat, his expensive suit now wrinkled with panic. His arrogance had vanished. He looked around the room, his eyes filled with fear. For the first time in a long time, he needed help. Then, before anyone else could react, the waiter stepped forward. He moved quickly, coming behind the rich man. Sir, I need you to stay calm, he said firmly. His voice carried no anger, no grudge, just focus. The rich man's body jerked, but he was too weak to resist. The waiter wrapped his arms around his abdomen and pressed hard. 1, 2, 3 times. Aloud, suddenly, the rich man coughed, a piece of steak shooting from his mouth onto the plate. Air rushed back into his lungs. He collapsed forward, gripping the table, his body trembling. He was alive. Silence filled the restaurant. Then, murmurs of shock. He just saved his life, someone whispered. The rich man coughed again, his hand still on his chest. His entire body was shaking. He had never felt this helpless before. He turned his head, looking up at the waiter, the same man he had humiliated minutes ago, the man he had mocked for being useless. And yet, that same man had saved him. The waiter stepped back, his face calm. "Are you okay, sir?" For the first time that evening, the rich man had nothing to say. He had spent the entire night making the waiter feel small. But now, he had never felt smaller. The restaurant was silent. Every eye was on the rich man, but he wasn't boasting anymore. His confidence was gone, replaced by something he wasn't used to: humility. He sat hunched over, still catching his breath. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his napkin, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The waiter stood nearby, waiting, not for thanks, but just to make sure he was okay. For the first time that night, the rich man looked at him properly. Not as a servant, not as someone beneath him, but as the man who had just saved his life. The weight of it hit him. He had spent the evening belittling this waiter, treating him as if he was nothing. Yet, when it mattered most, the person he looked down on was the only one who stepped forward to help. His throat was dry, but he finally managed to speak. "Thank you." The words felt foreign coming from his mouth. He wasn't used to thanking people. He was used to being thanked. The waiter simply nodded. "It's my job to help, sir." The rich man flinched. The words stung, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were true. The waiter had helped without hesitation, without pride, without expecting anything in return. The customers who had witnessed everything started clapping. It wasn't for the rich man, it was for the waiter. A few even stood up, nodding at him in respect. The rich man swallowed hard, his face burning with embarrassment. This wasn't the attention he was used to. Slowly he reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick stack of bills. He placed it on the table. "For you," he said quietly. "I was wrong about you. About a lot of things." The waiter glanced at the money but didn't reach for it. "I don't do this for tips, sir." The rich man's chest tightened. He had spent his life believing money was the only thing that mattered, that respect could be bought, that power was everything. But here was someone who had nothing, yet carried himself with more dignity than he ever had. For the first time, the rich man felt ashamed, not of being weak, but of how he had treated others. He pushed the money toward the waiter again. "Please, take it." The waiter hesitated, then finally accepted it, not out of greed but because he knew it was more than just money. It was a sign of change. The rich man stood up, adjusting his jacket. He still felt unsteady, not just from the choking, but from the realization that tonight had changed something inside him. He looked at the waiter one last time before walking toward the exit, his usual arrogance nowhere to be seen. The waiter watched him go, then picked up the plates from the table. To him, it was just another night at work. But to the rich man, it was a lesson he would never forget.